Today I would like to review the Oxford Study Edition of the New English Bible with the Apocrypha. You see it here lying on the desktop. This is a normal hardback type binding. It has no ribbon markers. It has blue and white head and tail bands. One might have expected a book like this to be Smythe sewn, but I am fairly confident that this is glued. I find no indication of sewing anywhere, no threads, no clearly visible signatures, and quite a lot of glue at the head and tail bands. So I believe this is a glued book. The dimensions are 9.5 inches tall and 6 1/4 inches wide, and it's about 1.5 inches thick. I've brought out a couple of similar books to give you a sense for the size. Here's the Oxford New Annotated Bible with Apocrypha and the Revised Standard Version, which is a bit thicker and roughly the same height, but a bit narrower. And here is the Didache Bible, both of which I've reviewed recently, and it's very similar to the Oxford Revised Standard Version that we just saw in size. Okay, so let's open it up. I'm going to take the dust jacket off for the review. This is a rather old book. Even though it's glued, it's held together fairly well. It was given to me as a Christmas present in 1987, so it's 31 years old. And again, this is the Oxford Study Edition, so it has notes. The Oxford Study Edition is in a double column format. What probably is more common, what would be more easy to find, although I must say these are available, say, on Amazon for about $25, and I'm sure you could find it on eBay as well. But what's more common is this single column format. This one has the Apocrypha in it as well, but it does not contain the notes. So the difference is the format and the fact that the one we're looking at today does have notes. We'll go into it bit by bit. We have one page of cardstock, then we have a sheet before the copyright page. The Bible, a New English translation, and this tells you the different churches that were involved in the translation. That's also discussed a little bit later in the introduction. And they have this disclaimer at the bottom of the page that says that even though the book has the Apocrypha in it, not all of these bodies that we just looked at consider them canonical. Then we have the copyright page, title page, New English Bible with the Apocrypha, Oxford Study Edition. Tells you who is responsible. So those aren't the translators, those are the people that are the editors of this study version. And I looked, but I wasn't able to find any history on this peculiar cross, which has clearly grapevines and perhaps olive branches in the background behind the cross on an octagon. And copyright information itself. New Testament was published in 1961, the Old Testament in 1970, and then a second edition of the New Testament in 1970. Corrected impressions were made in 1972, so this is the 1972 corrected impression, and it's printed in the United States of America. Table of contents. So we'll look at some of this material. Old Testament, then Apocrypha, separated out as is common in Protestant Bibles, and then the New Testament with some special articles at the end. The blank page, editor's preface, and here we find people responsible in the editorial committee. So although the translation itself was largely done in the UK, this Oxford Study Edition had members who are, it appears, entirely from United States universities. based or schools of divinity. Well, here's one from Toronto, Ontario. And then another interesting thing here is that the Bishop of Worcester, Massachusetts, Bernard J. Flanagan, gave his imprimatur to the New English Bible Oxford Study Edition. That must have been back in the 1960s or 70s. The preface gives the history, and in fact, with this translation, you can name a person who's most singularly responsible for it. The Reverend G.S. Hendry agitated for it in the Presbytery of Stirling and Dunblane in the Church of Scotland. Multiple churches got involved after this. The Presbyterian Church of Scotland General Assembly decided to approach the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, the Methodists, the Baptists, and the Congregational churches. They had another meeting, and the Presbyterian Church in England, the Society of Friends, the Church in Wales, etc. got involved, and even the Roman Catholic Church in England and Scotland became observers. So once they got started, they formed 3 translation committees, one for the Old Testament, one for the Apocrypha, one for the New Testament, and then there was a 4th panel, which was the style panel. And my understanding is that C.S. Lewis was a member of that group. And the different panels did their translation work. Translation work came to the Style Committee. Those advisors sent their suggested changes back to the translation panel, who decided whether to use it or not, and then everything finally went in final form to a joint committee, which met twice a year in the Jerusalem Chamber of Westminster Abbey, with a few exceptions from 1954 to 1955. Interesting though, although this book started work, the translation started its life in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, it seemed to have been led later on by Anglican bishops, Huncan of Truro, and then they mention Williams, who was Bishop of Durham, and then of Winchester. So it's sort of a Scottish Presbyterian and Anglican work. So here we come to the books themselves. They give the pages on which those start. So the Old Testament is a little over 1,000 pages long, a little over 232 for the Apocrypha. The New Testament is over 313 pages long. I think this would be a good point here, looking at the table of contents, to let you know that the paper, as is typical on these Oxford books, is very flat. It's a nice paper. And as you can see, there's some show through from the other side, but I think it's acceptable in this volume. The sheet thickness is about 39 micrometers, and I estimate the paper weight at about 35 GSM. Looking at the table of contents here, I wanted to point out that the apocryphal books are essentially the same as those that are in the Cambridge Cameo with the Apocrypha. And if you look at this graphic, I think it's pretty clear that these books are the books that are in the Roman Catholic deuterocanonical portion of the canon. So the way to read this chart is that the blue books here are the books and fragments that are in the Apocrypha in the New English Bible. They only constitute some of the apocryphal books that were in the Codex Alexandrinus. That's a 5th century manuscript. The Roman Catholic canon seems to be entirely taken care of by these books, and in fact one book that's not in that canon, 2nd Esdras, is also in the Apocrypha in the New English Bible. The New English Bible, though, is not sufficient to cover the Eastern Orthodox canon. For that, then you need to use the Orthodox Study Bible or the Revised Standard Version Oxford Study Bible, the one that I reviewed a few weeks back. Okay, let's get back to the review then. It's also interesting that the New English Bible, from a Catholic perspective, it is approved in England and Wales for use in the Divine Office. But as far as I can tell, looking at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops website, it is not approved in the United States. So we have alphabetical order of the books of the Bible. We have some miscellaneous abbreviations. ARAM means Aramaic, GK means Greek, HEB means Hebrew, PESH is Peshitta, which is sort of an Aramaic translation that people date, I think, to about the 5th century. New English Bible, sort of a cover page, the contents to the Old Testament. So you'll see the contents to the Old Testament, contents to the Apocrypha, and contents to the New Testament, even though we've seen the entire contents earlier. I think that's because the different sections have been published separately. There is an introduction to the Old Testament, and the key point here I want to draw your attention to is that the text they used here is R. Cattell's Biblia Hebraica, 3rd edition, 1937. So that's the main source that they used. But they also used the Samaritan Pentateuch, which they mention here, and they used other versions like the Septuagint, which they say is valuable for the recovery of the original Hebrew because it's based on an underlying Hebrew text older than the Masoretic. Mention the Targums. Then there's a page introducing the Pentateuch, and this is not a believer's study Bible. This is a modern critical higher criticism study Bible, and they talk about the JEDP hypothesis. They tell you what the translator's footnotes contain, cross-references. They tell you when they've transposed verses, give the meaning of proper names, where it's reflected in the context. Alternate interpretation, where the Hebrew is capable of such, and indicate places where the translators have adopted what seems to them a more probable correction of the text. So they do correct the Hebrew here in this translation, where they can't make sense of it as it reads. They conjecture as to how it should have read. Marginal numbers in this translation, somewhere in the introduction to the translation, they point out that they're very much a meaning by meaning type, a dynamic equivalence translation. This probably was the first one made by committee in modern English, and so that's the reason that these numerals here in the borders are not in the text. It's because they've taken quite a lot of liberty with the arrangement of the words, and the matter doesn't always break exactly as it would in the original, because they've sort of kind of paraphrased the material there. The single column New English Bible does the same thing with the page references, the verse references in the column. The Jerusalem Bible, which is just about as free, or maybe even freer than the New English Bible, also puts verse references in the column. But what they do is they put a little dot in the text to break the verses apart. The New English Bible is quite free, as you can see here from this chart. This is my revised chart of the translation continuum, and the New English Bible is way off there to the right. It is almost as free as the Jerusalem Bible, which you just saw. In this book, the books of the Bible always start on their own page, and in fact they have a little introduction for each one, and there are notes at the bottom of the page. It is not line matched. You may not be able to tell that looking here, because it's almost accidentally line matched at this point. But I think if you look here, you'll be able to see that there is a little bit of an offset in this point. It was printed long before line matching became popular. Alright, so we'll go forward We get to the end of the Old Testament. And the last page in the Old Testament portion of the book is an appendix with measures of length and capacity and weight in coins. And then we come to the New English Bible, the Apocrypha of the Oxford Study Edition, with a table of contents for it. And then there's an introduction. And the key point here is that the text that they use was Sweet's the Old Testament in Greek according to the Septuagint. Sweet also wrote a book about the Septuagint itself, not the text, but sort of an introduction to the Septuagint, which I have here in my little library. A little essay on the place of the Apocrypha, more about the marginal numbers, and then you come to the first book of Esdras, which, just like Genesis, has its own introduction, and you have footnotes at the bottom of the page. Text of the Bible is in 2 columns, but text of the footnotes is in the single column. Go forward, and the end of the Apocryphal section is at the end of 2nd Maccabees on page 257, and there's a sheet leading you into the New Testament with again a table of contents. And an introduction to the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is not based on any specific Greek text. There was a Greek text that was prepared on the basis of the choices that they made. They essentially looked at all the variant readings that were available, and the translators themselves became the textual critics. And the result of their work was printed in 1964, the Greek New Testament, by R.V.G. Tasker. So that Greek reflects the English that these translators decided to use. Let's see. Here is where they talk about their meaning for meaning approach. We've conceived our task to be that of understanding the original as precisely we could. We say again in our own native idiom what we believe the author to be saying in his. See, the older version, that is the more literal way of translating, the older method of translation allowed comfortable ambiguity, which I actually much prefer. What they do here is they are interpreting the text quite a lot for you. They're not leaving it up to you to make a decision of what the author meant. They're deciding it in the English for you and taking that option away from you. Page 6 talks about the marginal numbers again. And they say the precise point where a new verse begins cannot be fixed sometimes. Occasionally, in the interest of clarity, the order of successive verses is reversed, and they give an example of where they've done that. And the Gospels have their own little sheet introducing them. Matthew starts on its own page. You'll see that there are no red letters. There is some print non-uniformity here. Back up and show you that in a pretty good place in the Apocrypha. Let's look at pages 167, which is fairly light, and 175 at the same time. Look at those next to each other. So this is a 1970s or early 1980s printing, and quite a lot of print non-uniformity there, and it's prevalent throughout the Bible. I think that's about as strong as the contrast gets, but one sees that throughout the book. Okay, New Testament ends on page 333, and we're into those special articles that we saw in the first table of contents. Table of Contents 1 of 4. So there's a essay here on reading the Bible, an essay on literary forms in the Bible, a sketch of the history and geography of the lands of the Bible. And then, essay on reckoning time, chronology, the Hebrew year, the day, a select index to people, places, and themes in the Bible. So they do not have a concordance in here, but they do have a select index. And then there's an index to the maps. And what we have in the way of maps are, we have 16 pages that have 9 Oxford maps on them in very flat paper with the map not in the gutter. Very nicely done. And then we're at the back. Now we'll talk a little bit more in more detailed fashion about the page layout and the font. As you can see here, as we pointed out multiple times, the book title and when the book starts is at the center top of the page, but it's typically over in the corner, on the outside corner, where it really should be. And it also shows you the chapter that appears on that page. The page numbers are bottom center below the notes. It has 2 columns of text, as we've mentioned, and each column is about 58 millimeters wide, with about 39 characters per column. I did find one column that had 42 characters wide. The page is tall enough, and when there are no notes or no breaks in the column, from top to bottom, you can get 56 lines of text in a column. Pages are 234 millimeters top to bottom and 151 left to right, so it's 9.2 inches tall and 5.94 inches wide. Typically the margins at the top are about 15 millimeters here. So that's to the top, from the top of the text to the top of the page. The bottom varies a bit, but it's around 18 millimeters at the bottom. The outer margin is about 12 millimeters, and the inner margin can be as much as 18 in here, considerably less than that at this point. Okay, we're still here on the first page of Judith, but now I'm going to look at the font. So here's my then, and here's my then on my card. And if you look, you've got 9.5 there on the right, and 9.5 is just a little bit shorter in terms of the capital letter, and the lowercase letters are close to being the same size. If you go up to 10 points, the T is about the right height, and the lowercase letters aren't wildly off. They're very close to being the same. So my guess is it's close to a 10-point Times New Roman equivalent. When I calculate the line height, measure the height of the column and divide by the number of lines, I get a line height that's equivalent to 10 points, almost exactly, in the pica system, where 1 point is 0.3514 millimeters. Line spacing looks good to me. This is not like many Bible fonts where the descenders are shrunk. This is just sort of a normal size descender on a G. It's not atrophied like they often are. But even with the normal size ascenders and descenders and normal size capital letters, it seems fairly adequate to me. I don't have any problems with that. I like the word spacing. I like the character spacing. I think it was very well done. There is no oblique or italic type in this text for translator-supplied words. Using translator-supplied words is very much against the dynamic equivalent philosophy of this translation. There are headings at the top of the page, and occasionally you'll have headings in the text. So here's an example of a heading at the top of the page. The Syrian invasion. And like I say, occasionally you'll find them in the text itself. It might take us quite a while to find one. We got lucky. Here's one in Esther. Plot against the Jews. I haven't discovered what the rhyme or rhythm is of putting them in the text or leaving them out of the text, but they occasionally are there. Occasionally there are gaps between paragraphs. So here we do have a gap between paragraphs. Usually there is no gap, like here, but occasionally there'll be a gap between the paragraphs in order to let you know as a reader that there's sort of a break. So here's one, and you'll notice that there's no heading there. So again, I don't understand the sense of why they did what they did. Putting gaps between the paragraphs when there's a break in the sense of the storyline makes sense, but why there are sometimes headings and sometimes not, I do not know. The notes down here in the corner, which tell you about things like textual issues, like this one here, some witnesses add, and 6, and there's a verse 6. You have to look back up and find the C. In this case, you know you're missing a verse 6, so it's much easier to find the C in the text. But reading it backwards that way, from the footnotes back to the text, can be something of a challenge. Okay, now we'll do some font comparisons. We'll do two. The New English Bible is on the stand, and I'm bringing over the Didache Bible to show the two fonts side by side. I believe that the line spacing is a bit better, more line spacing in the Didache Bible. I believe the characters are a little bit smaller, although not very much, and at least in this place in the text, the New English Bible is printed more darkly, but very similar. And this is the Oxford Revised Standard Version. Similar study Bible, different translation, and the Oxford Revised Standard Version Annotated Study Bible has a few more apocryphal books than the New English Bible does. Printed a bit more boldly, but otherwise very similar. In this section of the video, we'll just take a look at the translation and a few familiar spots to give you a sense for it. Here we are in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning of creation, when God made heaven and earth, the earth was without form and void, with darkness over the face of the abyss, and a mighty wind that swept over the surface of the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated light from darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness night. So evening came, and morning came, the first day. You'll notice there that it has a mighty wind instead of a spirit. But if you look down at the note that corresponds to this raised letter B there, it says, and the Spirit of God hovering. So they allow for the Spirit of God, but they chose to put mighty wind in the text. Okay, second instance. Here we're in Ruth chapter 1. You see, said Naomi, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. Do not urge me to go back and desert you, Ruth answered. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So it's interesting, I like the fact that they've retained shall. It's a shame that we've lost that from the English language in most Bible translations. Here we are in the 22nd Psalm. My God, why hast thou forsaken me, and art so far from saving me, from heeding my groans? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou dost not answer. In the night I cry, but get no respite. And yet thou art enthroned in holiness. Thou art he whose praises Israel sings. I like this, the fact that they're retaining this more archaic language when addressing God. This is the same as was done in the Revised Standard Version, not the New Revised Standard Version, but the older one, and in the original New American Standard Bible. Now Isaiah 53. Who could have believed what we have heard, and to whom has the power of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before the Lord like a young plant whose roots are in parched ground. He had no beauty, no majesty to draw our eyes, no grace to make us delight in him. His form disfigured, lost all the likeness of man. His beauty changed beyond human semblance. He was despised, he shrank from the sight of men. Tormented and humbled by suffering, we despised him, we held him of no account, a thing from which men turn away their eyes. Yet on himself he bore our suffering, our torments he endured, while we counted him smitten by God, struck down by disease and misery. He was pierced for our transgressions, tortured for our iniquities. The chastisement he bore is health for us, and by his scourging we are healed. We had all strayed like sheep, each of us had gone his own way, but the Lord laid upon him the guilt of us all. Stop it there, and I just wanted to show you the notes at the bottom of the page. Make no mention of this being a prophecy of Christ. They take the view that this has to do with Israel, the nation, not having anything to do with the Messiah. Now, while we're here in this Old Testament neighborhood, let's take a look at a couple of book introductions. This is the introduction to Isaiah, and they say that collections of Isaiah's prophecies seem to have existed separately. When these were gathered into one book, the words of the collector editors and of later writers seem to have been added. Many units in these chapters, therefore, are easily recognized as not those of Isaiah, but written in a different style and reflecting a later historic situation. Chapters 40 through 55 are from an unknown prophet, now called Second Isaiah, active in Babylon toward the end of the exile. And those words were then appended, they say. So again, as I said earlier, it's not a believer's Bible at all, not a believer's study Bible. Now here we are at Daniel, and this is the intro here, and they're not very blunt about it, but they say essentially that they think it was written in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Stories and visions are set in the Babylonian and Persian periods, but they reflect a later time, primarily that of the successors to Alexander the Great. And so they're suggesting here that it's written at a later time. Now we're in Luke chapter 1, starting with verse 46, and I'll read just a couple of verses. This is a section called the Magnificat, which you may not even recognize read in this translation. And Mary said, "Tell out, my soul, the greatness of the Lord. Rejoice, rejoice, my spirit, in God my Savior. So tenderly has he looked upon his servant, humble as she is. For from this day forth all generations will count me blessed. So wonderfully has he dealt with me, the Lord, the Mighty One." I'm making a little room to show you that in the King James Version, so you'll remember how it's supposed to read. And Mary said, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Saviour, for he hath regarded the low estate of his handmaiden. For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. For he that is mighty hath done to me great things, and holy is his name." Radically different. John 1 through 5. When all things began, the Word already was. The Word dwelt with God, and what God was, the Word was. The Word then was with God at the beginning, and through him all things came to be. No single thing was created without him. All that came to be was alive with his life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines on in the dark, and the darkness has never mastered it. Another thing I want to point out here in the first chapter of John is verse 18. No one has ever seen God but God's only Son. He who is nearest to the Father's heart, he has made him known. And then the footnote down below gives you some of the other readings here. So they've taken the only begotten Son reading and then translated it a bit differently. But note E there gives you the other readings. It's the last one there that's more common today. That's what's accepted in the Nestle Aland 28th edition. We're in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 8, and I just want to show this kind of unique translation. But I shall remain at Ephesus until Whitsuntide, for a great opportunity has opened for effective work, and there is much opposition. So most translations would have Pentecost there instead of Whitsuntide. So we're at the summary, and I would say that in terms of prose, that this book has the advantage of reading very, very well. Now, I'm not an eloquent enough person to explain what it is that I like about the translation, but it just holds my attention. It has kind of a zest to it, a character to it that I can't describe, but I really do like the New English Bible. And that may be because it's in British English and not American English. The translators, as far as I know, were all English or Scottish or Welsh. It kind of reminds me, or rather the Revised New Jerusalem Bible kind of reminds me of it in certain ways. It's a very free translation, which normally I would take as a negative, but I would consider this as a supplement, kind of like reading a commentary. And so the fact that it's free is actually kind of useful because it's giving me one possible interpretation of the text. One of the things I very much like about it is the fact that, I like the two-column layout here. I like the fact that in the New Testament there are no bright pink letters that would annoy me. And I think the font layout and the style and the design there is very attractive. On the negative side, I would say mainly that these notes, the skeptical notes, are the major downside. That and the fact that this binding is glued. Although it's held up well, it's not the kind of Bible that you would want to get rebound at some point. If you would like a New English Bible and thinking about getting one rebound, then perhaps you'd want to buy one of these. I'm sure that they can be gotten for $10 or less off Amazon or eBay. This one in very good condition can be bought from Amazon for about $25. But one like this, I think these are quite cheap. I believe I paid, this says $8 as is. It has the flyleaf torn out, but it's largely unmarked. And it's a single column format, fairly wide column, but you have very definitely a sewn binding. I think you can just tell from the signatures there. Very definitely sewn, so it's going to hold together much longer. And you don't have any notes at the bottom of the page except those translation notes, and they seem to be in a bit of a larger font. So with that, I'll conclude my review of the Oxford Study Edition of the New English Bible with the Apocrypha, and I want to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like it, and if you haven't already done so, you're certainly welcome to subscribe. Thanks again for watching.